All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my good friend Lisa Graves. Lisa is the executive director for the Center for Media and Democracy, which you can find at prwatch.org. You can also find her on Twitter at @TheLisaGraves. Lisa, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Oh, Matt, thanks for having me on. I'm so happy to be here.
All right, so Lisa, most of us on the left are familiar with the Koch brothers. Generally, they're funding the far right-wing agenda. They're funding of bills. They're funding of legislators. So the Center for Media and Democracy and the Progressive magazine recently released a new report detailing the connection between one of the Koch brothers, Charles Koch, and the John Birch Society. If listeners aren't aware, begin by describing for them what exactly was the John Birch Society.
The John Birch Society was founded in the late 1950s after Senator Joe McCarthy and his Red Scare tactics were discredited. After Joe McCarthy died, this organization popped up. It was an organization founded by a couple of millionaires like Fred Koch, Charles and David Koch's father, spearheaded by a candy manufacturer named Robert Welch, who got his money with sugar babies and junior mints. I'm sorry to tell you if you've ever had sugar babies or junior mints, but that was his family company. And he thought that there was an enormous communist threat within the United States. Mr. Welch said that he thought that Eisenhower was sympathetic to the communists, and President Eisenhower was not just a Republican president, he was also the former Allied commander basically in Europe during World War II. And so these were pretty extreme positions, pretty extreme views, but he was joined by Fred Koch and a couple of other millionaires to really start this organization and launch not just an attack on a number of politicians like Eisenhower, but also on the Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court was one of their targets. They claimed it was pro-communist. And other major social movements, in particular the Civil Rights Movement, was one of their targets.
And prior to this, I mean, people were aware that the Koch brothers' father was connected and one of the founders of the John Birch Society. But up until now, we actually haven't had any direct evidence that either of the Koch brothers were actually involved, and you guys at the Center for Media and Democracy and Progressive Magazine have actually found documentation tying Charles Koch directly to the John Birch Society. Tell us about it.
That's right. We did an archive review that has looked at archives across the country, and we discovered that Charles Koch was in fact a member of the John Birch Society. It wasn't just his father. When he moved home to Wichita after college in his 20s, as he took on a leadership role within the company that became Koch Industries, he was living at home for a time, and he was following his father's footsteps. So his father issued a tract against what he considered to be the communists in education, teachers, textbooks, the Supreme Court, etc., in 1961. And Charles Koch had become active and involved in his dad's interests at that time. And what we discovered in the archives were documents from the 1960s showing that Charles Koch was a lifetime member of the John Birch Society, that he was a leader in Wichita, that he was funding the John Birch Society's magazine, funding its radio shows, supporting its bookstore in town. And its bookstore was just filled with books attacking Martin Luther King, booklets attacking the Civil Rights Movement of 1964, attacking the Voting Rights Act of 1965, attacking the Fair Housing Act of 1968. The John Birch Society bookstore there in Wichita and across the country and other bookstores were filled with materials to support your local police in the aftermath of photos that raced across the country showing police brutality against civil rights activists, dogs biting civil rights activists, fire hoses trained at civil rights activists. That bookstore and the materials that were pushed by the John Birch Society while Charles Koch was a member and a leader there in Wichita included materials that basically supported the riots, in essence, in Mississippi against James Meredith, integrating Ole Miss back in the early 1960s, lauding the person, General Walker, who helped stand at the courthouse door with the governor against integration. And so, it was a pretty extreme organization, and Charles Koch was an active member of it.
Not even just an active member of it, like funding it, and like he had his hand in the bookstore itself that was selling all this stuff. I remember seeing that they said in one of their, I don't know if it was a book or a tract or whatever that they had, that you mentioned the dog photos, the famous, like, it's one of the iconic images of the civil rights era of like police sicking dogs on African Americans, and they actually had one that said that those photos were fake, right? They actually said that this is before Photoshop too. So I mean, like, what were they thinking?
Well, it's extraordinary. So one of the sort of things that shocked the conscience of America, people who had sort of been ignoring segregation, was in Birmingham, Alabama, when Bull Connor directed the police and the firefighters to use attack dogs and high-pressure fire hoses against civil rights marchers. This was after Medgar Evers had been assassinated. He was the NAACP's field staffer. This was, after a lot of white racist Ku Klux Klan violence against African Americans. And what the John Birch Society claimed was that the famous photo of the dog attacking the civil rights activist was a sham, and that the, quote, Negro victim's trousers had been cut with a razor in advance so it would fall away more readily by the first touch of the dog. You could not really capture a more revisionist view of history than the one that the John Birch Society was peddling. And that document called Two Revolutions at Once, was published at a time that we know Charles Koch was actively promoting the John Birch Society.
I'm talking to my friend Lisa Graves, Executive Director of the Center for Media and Democracy. You can find that at prwatch.org. You can follow her on Twitter at @TheLisaGraves. You can find all of these documents and reports not only at PR Watch and at progressive.org, but also at the website, because that's what PR Watch does. They do amazing work when they make giant websites. It's kochexposed.org. You can find all of these documents there. It's crazy. And in addition to some of the things you mentioned, you write that the Birchers actually were very heavily active calling for the impeachment of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Tell us why the John Birch Society wanted to impeach Earl Warren.
Well, Earl Warren was also a Republican governor. He was chosen by Eisenhower for the Supreme Court. He came on right before the Supreme Court issued the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which was a decision that ordered the desegregation of American public schools, the decision that said that separate was not, it said that separate was inherently unequal. And he was a target of the John Birch Society. He issued some other decisions as Chief Justice with a majority of that court, protecting people's First Amendment rights, Americans' First Amendment rights, and protecting and reinvigorating the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment and the Sixth Amendment to give them real meaning. But the main target, at least as you can see from their materials, was really Brown v. Board. They have a number of materials that they were circulating. John Birch Society was obsessed with Brown v. Board. They had impeach Earl Warren, signpost billboards in cities across the country, in the Deep South, and also in Wichita or near Wichita. And they were relentless in trying to get the Supreme Court justice impeached. At the same time, they were actively recruiting Strom Thurmond. So in the early 1960s, as Strom Thurmond, the former Dixiecrat candidate for president, a total segregationist, anti-civil rights, white supremacist. I think that record is quite clear on that for Strom over the bulk of his career. They were recruiting him to join the John Birch Society because he was defending their point of view on the floor of the Senate. He was standing there opposing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and opposing the Civil Rights Act of 1965. He declined their request for membership to join them because he said he wanted to remain independent. But that didn't stop Fred Koch in 1966-67 from trying to recruit him to run as an independent for vice president of the United States. So, the idea that they were just concerned about so-called, quote, communism, which they claimed the Supreme Court embodied, which is an absurd charge. The reality is they were actively promoting a segregationist to become one heartbeat away from the presidency. And in fact, the person that they promoted to be president under this ticket that didn't fly was Ezra Taft Benson, who was one of the leaders of the Mormon Church, who at the time, was also supporting the segregation of the Mormon Church.